My name is Ruqaiya Dalal.
I'm Hannah Albertson.
I'm Ava Chandler.
And today we'll be talking about our research project called Working Memory and Encoding Nonverbal Social Cues. Does Attention Matter? So we're going to start off with a little bit of background information.
So it's important to know a little bit about social functioning for our study, which is based on the premise that social cognitions are mechanisms that lead to social behaviors, which then determines how someone interacts with their environment. So social functioning is important to study because deficits in it can lead to aggressive or deviant behavior as well as other difficulties later in life. So there are multiple models of social functioning, but we're going to look at the social information processing or SIP model because it's well researched. So there's 6 steps in this model, but our study mainly focuses on the first one, which is encoding of cues. So when someone is faced with a social situation, the first thing they're going to do is encode cues in order to have something to interpret. So these cues can include anything like body movement, like hand gestures or facial expressions. And so when cues are noticed and then focused on, what people do is give them meaning. And then this meaning then determines how someone responds or reacts to a social situation.
Generally, your individual ability to function in a social situation is attributed to your executive functioning ability. And overall, executive functioning is thought to contain over 30+ skills, but specifically, it's thought to contain higher order cognitive processes, specifically like memory or self-regulation or organization. But for the specific study, we're focusing on working memory and selective attention. As I just said, working memory is one of the most researched aspects of executive functioning, and it's thought to be what is being currently held in the mind and being actively manipulated towards a set goal. In terms of capacity, individuals and groups can vary across, so one individual could have a much higher working memory capacity than another individual. And when you increasingly strain your working memory to add more information to it, it's harder to distribute your focus across multiple tasks. And due to the connection between executive function, working memory, and social functioning, if you were to tax your working memory, it's thought that you would also tax your ability to function in a social situation. And this ties back to past studies of children with ADHD and attention deficits, because they're believed to have a lower working memory capacity to begin with. So if you tax it to a higher degree, they'll have a harder time in a social situation than an individual with a higher working memory capacity.
So when thinking about the design, a lot of the past prior literature has to do with the correlation design. And as Ava just stated, a lot of the prior research also has to focus on clinical populations such as ADHD. But the current study will fill in this gap by using an experimental design in a dimensional sample. So now we're going to talk a little bit about our study. So our study had 2 different hypotheses. The first hypothesis being as working memory load increases, the ability to accurately encode social cues will decrease. The second hypothesis that we had was attention problems will moderate the relationship between conditions, and we had 2 different types of conditions, being the single and the dual task. So we're going to talk a little bit about the methods that we use now.
Okay, so our study had a total of 54 participants. However, we only did data analysis from 40 of them because 14 participants failed validity checks in the surveys, so we didn't want their data to potentially compromise the rest. So as you can see, we had majority females for our study. Also based on average GPA as well as SAT and ACT scores, we had an overall pretty intelligent population with them being in the 85th percentile. We also had participants fill out an executive functioning self-report survey, and based on that, we got that they were in the 50th percentile, which just means that our group overall had normal executive functioning skills.
And then we had a couple of different measures that we used. We had 2 different dual task designs. The first being the PONS task, which is the profile of nonverbal sensitivity, which is just a classic measure of nonverbal social cues. And then we also used the NVAC task, which is just a classic measure of working memory. And then we looked at 2 different types of surveys, the first one being the adult self-report, which just looks at the individual's adaptability and their corresponding problems, like such as anxiety and depression. And then lastly, we looked at the Barkley Deficits and Executive Functioning Scale, which is just a self-reported method of executive functioning in an individual's everyday life. So we're going to talk a little bit about the task that each individual did.
Overall, each participant completed both the dual and the single task design. It just varied in terms of whether they completed the single or the dual task first. And in the single single in-back test, the participants went through 3 sets. That is 0 back, a 1 back, and a 2 back in-back test. For the 0 back, the participant said snap when the target letter was presented. So in this example, if it was F, it would be snap L, snap Y, Y, H. And in the 1 back, the participant said snap when the target letter was presented 2 times in a row. So it would be F, L, F, Y, snap, H. And then the 2 back test was when the participant said snap when the target letter was presented 2 letters ago. So in this instance, it would be F, L, snap, Y, Y, H. And then for the pond single task, the participants watched 3 sets of 12 2-second video clips. And then at the end, they were given 3 options, and they chose which they thought best correlated to what happened in the video itself. Here's an example. And then in the dual task design, the participant completed both tasks simultaneously. So while they were listening to the audible in-back test corresponding to the 0 back, the 1 back, or the 2 back, they also watched the video at the same time and then answered at the end what option they thought correlated to the video.
So we did a paired samples t-test for our first hypothesis that as working memory load increases, social encoding ability would decrease. As you can see from the graph, we had a main effect of condition with participants doing significantly worse during the dual task. So the average percent correct for a dual task was about 60%, and the average percent correct for pond single was about 65%. We also calculated a Cohen's d number, which just tells us the size of the effect. We got 8.71, which is deemed a medium to large effect.
And then in order to conceptualize our second hypothesis, we used a classic model to show a moderating effect between 2 variables. And based on prior literature, we thought that attention problems would moderate the relationship between the single task and the dual task. And in order to analyze the data from our second hypothesis, we used a macro for SPSS called memory. So repeated measures moderation analysis, which allows us to assess and estimate the effect of the moderating factor, attention problems, against the 2 conditions.
So this is our results for hypothesis 2, and as Ava just stated, we used the memory, which is a repeated measure moderation analysis. And our hypothesis 2 was looking at if attention problems will moderate based on the effect single versus dual. And we unfortunately did not find that there was a difference in attention based on the moderation. Despite the graph looking like it does overlap, we found no significant interaction between attention and performance on the PONS task, and we'll discuss a little later why we believe that happened. So a little bit about our discussion. In our first hypothesis, we found as working memory load increases that the ability to attend to social stimulus would decrease, and along with working memory capacity is reached or increasingly taxed, the ability to accurately encode social cues would also decrease. So an example of this that could relate to your everyday life is if working memory load is for the single task and you're sitting in a room by yourself with another individual or your significant other, all your focus is able to go to that one individual rather than if you're in the room with the same person or significant other. While there's a lot of noise and you're vying for their attention, it's harder for you to focus on.
Okay, so I'm going to discuss some limitations of our study as well as why we think we didn't see that moderating effect of attention. So as I stated previously, our population overall was pretty intelligent. They also had normal executive functioning skills. So in the future, it'd probably be a good idea just to get people that had a variety of intellectual and executive functioning capabilities. I also stated earlier that we had originally 54 participants, but only did data analysis on 40. And because we did this, our data analysis was likely underpowered. So for the future, what we could do is just try to get more participants due to those people failing validity checks. And the 2 reasons why we think we didn't see that effect of attention was because we used a self-report method when measuring attention, as well as we saw a ceiling effect in our results. So what we could do in future studies for this is use an attention measure that's performance-based to give us more accurate results in measuring attention problems. An example of a measure that could be used is the Connors continuous performance task. And as I just said, we also saw a ceiling effect, and this was due to the PONS task itself. So I just have an animation here that conceptualizes what the ceiling effect was. So the floor represents getting 0% correct on the PONS task. The ceiling represents getting 100% correct on the task. However, our results did not show us a range this big at all. Instead of our ceiling being at 100, it was at around 65%. Our floor was around 60%. So what this means is that even though overall our population was pretty intelligent, no one could get better than around 65% correct on the PONS task. And so this small range likely does not represent the true variance of social encoding ability in the population. A restricted range like this also makes it harder to find a moderating effect if there is a moderating effect of attention. So what could be done in the future to help this is just using a PONS task that is more effective at measuring social encoding ability in order to decrease the chance of a ceiling effect happening again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for this group?
Yes.
Did you analyze the impact data or just the PONS data?
We didn't use the impact data this semester, but Dr. Hilton may use it later. We just focused on the PONS task.
Why did you think you'd find the moderating effect of attention in the study?
Because in order to encode nonverbal social cues, it's important to focus and therefore pay attention to them. So say if you have attention problems like someone who has ADHD, if you're not paying attention to these cues, you're not likely to encode them, and therefore you're likely to miss them.
Does this work say anything about the multitasking, people multitasking?
I don't think we know any, we didn't look into that, but maybe that could be a future study that they could look into. That just wasn't something we focused on this semester.
What was the validity check that y'all did?
We did, the validity check was during the surveys. It had, while they were doing the Barkley and the self-report, there was 3 questions, and basically it just said, if you're paying attention, pick this answer. And so if you, by failing the validity check meant that you weren't paying attention, and so if you weren't paying attention to that, we were scared you weren't answering the questions like truthfully or really paying attention during the PONS task, so we just didn't want that to compromise the rest of the data for people who actually weren't paying attention.
Since attention seems so limited, is the future implication of this that kids with ADHD or attention problems might have difficulty being social, like they might have social deficits?
Yes, that's actually all of Dr. Hilton's research primarily, is in children with ADHD. We just looked at it in a population that we weren't focusing on people with ADHD, but he's primarily, we're not going to say he's proven it, he's found some results that state that. But similar, he just wanted to do it in a population that is not related to the psychiatric diagnosis.
All right, thank you.